The member for Prospect to say prayers.
Almighty God, from whom all wisdom and power are derived, we beseech thee so to direct and prosper the deliberations of the Legislative Assembly now assembled, that all things may be ordered upon the best and surest foundations for the glory of thy name and for the safety, honor, and welfare of the people of these islands. Bless our sovereign lady, Queen Elizabeth II, Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, Charles, Prince of Wales, and all the royal family. Give grace to all who exercise authority in our Commonwealth, that peace and happiness, truth and justice, religion and piety may be established among us. Especially we pray for the governor of our islands, the premier, the speaker of the Legislative Assembly, the leader of the opposition, ministers of cabinet, ex officio members, members of the Legislative Assembly, the Chief Justice, and members of the judiciary, that we may be enabled faithfully to perform the responsible duties of our high office. All this we ask for thy great name's sake. Let us say the Lord's Prayer together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. The Lord bless us and keep us. The Lord make his face shine upon us and be gracious unto us. The Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon us and give us peace now and always. Amen.
Please be seated. Proceedings in this Honorable Legislative Assembly are now resumed.
Administration of oaths or affirmations.
None.
Reading by the Honourable Speaker of Messages and Announcements.
None.
Presentation of petitions.
None.
Presentation of papers and of reports.
None.
Questions to Honourable Ministers and members of the Cabinet. The elected member for Georgetown Central to ask the Honourable Minister of Health, Environment, Culture and Housing. Question number 8.
Question number 8. The member for Georgetown Central.
Mr. Speaker, unfortunately the minister is not here. Mr. Speaker, I rise to ask a question on the order paper number 8. Can the Honourable Minister say whether Health City Hospital has been allowed to practice in additional areas of medical practice beyond that which was agreed upon when it was awarded its license and concessions?
Honourable members and member for Georgetown Central asking the question. The minister is not yet arrived to his seat. So we will move that both questions be put down at a later point today when the minister arrives. The member for Georgetown Central.
Mr. Speaker, forgive me for my concern that I have to highlight, but this is the second time now that these questions have had to been pushed down the order paper and somewhat off the order paper of the day. Last 2 evenings ago, similar thing happened. I just want, if I can get some confirmation from the government that my questions will be answered today.
The honourable member, the indication is that the minister will answer the question. It's just that he hasn't arrived as yet. The same thing the other day. And if you remember that when he came, I indicated at one point in the day, and you say just let it go. That's what happened. To me, between us, that was. And I would suggest that when the minister comes, you try to get the question in at that point. I can't say at what point that is because we don't know when the minister will get to his seat. As soon as the minister comes and we are at a point that can break, then I will allow you to ask your questions at that time. The Honorable Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, also on a matter of this procedure, I have a number of questions that I've submitted. I've had no indication whether or not they will be put on any order paper, and I don't know if the clerk could let us know if she has received answers to those questions as yet.
Honorable Member, when questions are asked, they've gone through all the proper procedures, sent to me, sent to the Business Committee, the clerk's office. They goes on to members, and then they come back to the House. And when they come back to the House, the questions are set down. I've seen an indication a few days ago from the Premier who said to members to be sure and get their questions to the clerk's office. Questions met with those with the answers, of course. And so, Honourable Member, I can't do any more than that. Item, please.
Statements by honourable ministers and members of the Cabinet.
I've received several, and the Honourable Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to make a statement.
Honourable Deputy Premier, I have agreed to the statement, of course. I haven't got it in my hand, and they're just arranging that. Give us a minute. Give the table a minute. Thank you.
Sarge. Year by year. 18, 19, 20. Yeah.
Please continue.
Thank you,
Honourable
Mr. Speaker.
Deputy Leader.
Mr. Speaker,
Deputy
I rise
Premier.
to make a statement in accordance with Section 11(6) of the Public Management and Finance Law in relation to Section 11(5) appropriations during the 2018 fiscal year. Mr. Speaker, Cal 2 Strategic Tourism Regional and Core Air Service was increased by $1.75 million in order to fund the increase in fuel costs, $1 million. Fund the cost of living adjustment, $540,000, and fund the introduction of the new route to Denver, Colorado, $210,000. This increase was partially funded by a $120,000 decrease in EA 125 Cayman Brac Emergency Shelter, $60,000 decrease in EA 60 Cayman Brac Bluff Playfield, and $40,000 decrease in EA 139 Little Cayman Boat Launch Ramp. The appropriation TP 66 Sister Islands Home Repairs was increased by $25,000 in order to fund additional urgent housing repairs for this fiscal year. This increase was funded by the decrease in EA 125 Cayman Brac Emergency Shelter in the same amount. Mr. Speaker, TP 67, Sports and Culture Program Assistance, was increased by $75,000 in order to fund additional programs in December of 2018. This increase was funded by a decrease in EA 125, Cayman Brac Emergency Shelter, same amount. The appropriation EA 55, Cayman Brac and Little Cayman Roads, was increased by $60,000 in order to fund urgent major repairs of the asphalt plant in that fiscal year. This increase was funded by a decrease in EA 144, public restrooms, in the same amount. Mr. Speaker, EA 143, Cruise Berthing Facility Project, was increased by $100,000 in order to fund additional costs involved with a three-stage tender process and an extended negotiation with the cruise lines. This increase was funded by a decrease in EI 68, Ministry of District Administration, in the same amount. Mr. Speaker, I move now the statement in accordance with Section 11.6 of the Public Management and Finance Law in relation to Section 11.5 during appropriations fiscal year 2019. Mr. Speaker, DAT 1 advice and support to the Minister of District Administration, Tourism, Transport was increased by $520,000 in order to fund additional expenses relating to public relations for the proposed development cruise berthing facility, $327,000, and fund a consultancy fee for review of Cayman Airways route schedule and aircraft fleet, $74,000. This increase was partially funded by $60,000 decrease in EA 144, public restrooms, and $60,000 decrease in CBO 20, advice and assistance to the Premier and administration of the Premier's office. Mr. Speaker, DAT 8, tourism advertising activities, was increased by $1 million in order to fund additional costs for creative destination filming necessary for tourism advertising, additional marketing of the Cal Denver route launch, and additional Canada promotions. Appropriations CAL2, Strategic Tourism, Regional and Core Air Service, was increased by $1.3 million in order to fund the cost of living adjustment and $1.1 million and fund the new route to Denver of $210,000. Mr. Speaker, TP 66, Sister Islands Home Repairs, was increased by $320,000 in order to fund additional urgent housing repairs for that year. This increase was partially funded by $70,000 decrease in EA 125, Cayman Brac Emergency Shelter. The line item TP 67, Sports and Cultural Tourism, was increased by $365,000 in order to fund additional programs, specifically the ongoing sargassum cleanup program via the BRAC NICE teams. To assist with ongoing sports and cultural programs and for financial assistance for major roof repairs to a church hall building. This increase was partially funded by a $100,000 decrease in EA 144 public restrooms and $15,000 CBO 20 advice and assistance to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, EI 68 Ministry of District Administration, Tourism and Transport was increased by $900,000 in order to complete project works at District Administration, continuation of architectural design, building renovation, daycare building renovation, government cottage renovation, vehicle heavy equipment fleet replacement, and National Weather Service continuation of architectural design of National Weather Service Office. The line item EA 55, Cayman Brac and Little Cayman Roads, was decreased by $40,000 in order to purchase road frontage land located on Block 98D, Parcel 10, adjoining the District Administration building in Stake Bay, Crown property. Mr. Speaker, EA 60, Cayman Brac Bluff Playfield, was increased by $500,000 in order to complete the construction of the 3 changing room buildings at BRAC 25-meter swimming pool facility, complete the pool's chemical storage building, and pay the construction retention funds. Mr. Speaker, EA 125, Cayman BRAC Emergency Shelter, was increased by $530,000 in order to complete the final stage of construction of the shelter, fund additional project management costs, fund portable stage, chairs, audio, video equipment necessary for public use of the facility, and assist with partial payment of a final claim settlement with the contractor. The appropriation 143, cruise berthing facility project, was increased by $2.2 million in order to fund additional design, development, professional services, and consultancy fees for legal, financial, and commercial expertise. EA 144, public restrooms, was increased by $140,000 in order to complete the construction of public restrooms located at West Bay Cemetery, North Side Starfish Point, East End Wreck of the 10 Sails. Mr. Speaker, there are appropriation changes for DAT 1 through DAT 14 that relate to reallocations from the central budget within the Ministry of Finance, Health, premium increases to more accurately reflect the cost of ministry outputs. Mr. Speaker, the last year, 2020, I make a statement in accordance with Section 11.6 of the Public Management and Finance Law in relation to the Section 11.5 appropriations during the 2020 fiscal year. Cal 1 Strategic Domestic Air Service was increased by $1.8 million in order to assist with meeting costs of domestic air service. The increase was funded by a decrease in EI-1 Cayman Airways Limited. Appropriation Cal 2 Strategic Tourism Regional Corps was increased by $14 million in order to secure a temporary fleet structure due to the ongoing grounding of the Boeing 737-8 MAX fleet. This increase was partially funded by a decrease in EI-1 Cayman Airways of $9.5 million. The appropriation TP-66 Sister Islands Home Repairs was increased by $300,000 in order to assist with the housing repairs of Sister Islands senior citizens and provide economic stimulus via construction sector. This increase was funded by a decrease in EI-68 Ministry of District Administration. Mr. Speaker, TP-67 Sports and Cultural Tourism was increased by $15,600,000 in order to assist with providing financial assistance to displaced Caymanian tourism employees that have been affected by COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting close of the Cayman Island borders. This increase was partially funded by the decrease in Department of Tourism 15 tourism advertising, activities, marketing, public relations, sales, and promotions of $4 million, a decrease in EA 143 cruise berthing project, $2.6 million, and the remaining funding of $9 million is being requested at this current Finance Committee. The appropriation TP-86 Sister Islands Beaches and Community Cleanup Program was increased by $300,000 to assist the Sister Islands economic stimulus employment relief effort. This increase was funded by a decrease in EI-68 Ministry of District Administration. EA 55, Cayman BRAC and Little Cayman Roads, was increased by $900,000 in order to assist with ongoing road repair and paving projects, Sister Islands, as well as economic stimulus relief from the impact of COVID-19. This increase was funded by a decrease in EA 157, Cayman Turtle Conservation Center, Cayman BRAC facility in the same amount. The appropriation EI-1 Cayman Airways Limited was increased by $300,000 in order to accommodate the payment of COVID-19 honorarium to deserving staff. Mr. Speaker, EI-82 Cayman Islands Airport Authority was increased by $154,000 in order to accommodate the payment of COVID-19 honorarium to deserving staff. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise under Standing Order 32.
When we took under regards to the questions, Standing Order
30, subsection 2.
Please proceed
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
in accordance with the standing order.
Can the Honorable Minister say if the government proposed cruise berthing plans are off the table completely?
Honorable Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think it's a very well-known fact that the Premier has said that there will be no dealing with the cruise berthing project in this administration. I can't speak for what other administrations will do.
Honorable member for Georgetown Central.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I was wondering if this would be a convenient time to revert back to questions on the order paper.
Please proceed. The minister is in his seat.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to ask question number 8 on the order paper standing in my name. Can the Honorable Minister say whether Health City Hospital has been allowed to practice in additional areas of medical practice beyond that which was agreed upon when it was awarded its license and concessions?
Honorable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, Speaker, the Health City Hospital, Cayman Islands, has not been allowed to practice in additional areas of medical practice beyond what was agreed in 2010.
The member for Georgetown Central supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Honorable Minister say if this government has any intentions of allowing Health City Cayman to operate in any additional areas of medical practice?
Honorable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for the question. What I can say to the member is that we have not received a request for what he's suggesting.
The member for Northside.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if the minister would have at hand the areas of medical specialty that Health City was originally, on the original agreement, allowed to practice, and is he aware that they are currently cleaning teeth?
Does the minister have that kind of information at hand?
Mr. Speaker, I do have some of that information available. The agreement states in part that the hospital will provide the following types of tertiary care not currently available in the islands: open heart bypass angioplasty, heart valve replacement, cancer treatment, bone marrow transplant, nuclear medicine, organ transplant, and various other similar major tertiary care procedures. I do know with these tertiary care hospitals that even though they're not allowed or not approved for dentistry, that there's also a need in the case of emergencies for a dentist of that nature to be able to do reconstructive surgery, etc. So I don't have any further information on that in terms of if they're cleaning teeth. I don't know whether it's something where it's a special case. I couldn't really answer that, Mr. Speaker.
Minister. Member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Honorable Minister say if there is a procedure of audit or checking to ensure that businesses such as Health City stay within the parameters of their practice, considering the concessions agreements that were agreed to on the basis of them staying within that practice? Because obviously we just heard there is an allegation of suspected working outside of those parameters. So my question is there somewhere within the medical authority that checks to ensure that this medical practice stays within their license arrangement?
Honorable Member, we can't proceed on allegations in here. At this point, I will not allow that supplementary.
Mr.
Honorable Member from Georgetown Central, supplementary.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I agree with you. Allegations is definitely not something we should allow. Hence the reason I'm asking the Minister if there is a practice where somebody keeps a check on anybody, not for that fact, doesn't matter whether it's Health City or any other company, but that they should stay within their practice of their license. And if he's aware of that from a health practice authority perspective.
Honorable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, thank the member for that question. This is the responsibility of the Health Practice Commission, and they apply to the Health Practice Commission if they want to provide a service outside of what they were approved to do, and they have to receive approval through the Health Practice Commission. If anyone else, I don't think that the government would want to restrict themselves if there was something noteworthy that a hospital requested that would benefit the citizens of this country, that it would have to go through the same process of how they have their approval now for the institution that they have, which would have to go through cabinet and to be approved. But in saying that, we would hope that persons or institutions would stick to whatever their license is saying. I mean, otherwise they're going outside the law. If someone has any other information, then they should provide it to the ministry. What I can say though is that I've instructed the ministry, our caucus has actually instructed me to instruct my ministry to do an evaluation of the current agreement and report back their findings. That'll take some time, obviously, but I can say that And I also want to apologize for not being in my seat when we resumed.
The Honorable Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to
Newlands.
thank the Minister for providing those answers. Actually, one of my questions was exactly about whether or not the agreement with government was being audited. Is the Minister aware of any written complaints from private practitioners with regard to this very subject matter of the health city operating outside of the scope of their agreement?
Before we continue, we had reached question time and we hadn't reached the hour 11 when we started, and therefore questions came into play. I better do, out of abundance of caution, suspend the standing order at this point.
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspension of the relevant standing order in order that questions can be asked past 11 a.m.
Question is that we suspend the relevant standing order to allow questions after 11 a.m. All in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. The member for Newlands, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Had you completed your question? You might want to, Honourable Minister, you might want to repeat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was asking if the Minister is aware of any written complaints sent in to the Ministry from private practitioners with regard to Health City possibly operating outside of the scope of their agreement with government.
Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can't personally say that. I don't have any written complaints to me as minister, or I've not seen any from the ministry.
The member for Newlands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a request then if the Minister could try to ascertain whether or not there are complaints, because I'm sure he would agree that it is sort of competition to give an entity concessions and then allow them to encroach upon the business of private practitioners.
Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question from the member. Obviously, when I took on the position in 2017, there were questions, even from our own HSA, as to some of the practices happening at that institution. Obviously, it's a demand and supply situation. What happened was Health City had every intention to uphold what was, in my opinion, what license they were given, and we had the public had such great confidence in the work that they were doing. They just started going there for any and everything. At one point, the institution wasn't even equipped to handle some of the things that persons were coming there for on a daily basis, and they had to turn some back. I personally know that by having conversations with the institution, and it just grew to a situation where persons just started going there for a bellyache. And I'm sure, like any doctor don't want to turn away a patient because it's a long drive down, etc. There were questions there. We've had discussions with the institution, had a plethora of meetings. We've had combination of meetings with HSA, private practitioners, and Health City in regard to trying to have a complementing nature rather than a competitive nature so that we can provide the best care possible for the citizens of Cayman. Obviously, that doesn't always go down well, but I've tried to ensure that everyone can coexist. As we'll note, that when Health City was born, I think they started in 2013 or thereabout, or 15, and there were a great uproar that Health City would take all the business from all the private practitioners and the HSA and everyone else. And I had the numbers, but I can estimate that there were some 65 or 35 Cayman doctors at the time, and some 160 foreign practitioners here on the island. And since Health City has been born, that has increased at least twofold in terms of Caymanian doctors, and also local private practitioners is 300 and something. So definitely it didn't hurt the business, but only helped it to increase. I hope that helps the member.
Next question.
The elected member for Georgetown Central to ask the Honourable Minister of Health, Environment, Culture and Housing. Question number 9.
Honourable member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to ask questions standing in my name on the order paper number 9. Can the Honourable Minister provide an update on the investigation into the vote of no confidence in the Director prepared by the staff of the Mosquito Research and Control Unit?
Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the member for that question. Mr. Speaker, as Minister, I have no involvement in personnel matters and is therefore unable to speak further to the query posed by the member. And I do believe under Section 55 of the Constitution, this is under the Deputy Governor.
Honourable member from Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was wondering, considering the seriousness of the fact that MRCU is such an important unit, considering the fact they spray chemicals into our communities that affect the lives of the people, whether or not the Deputy Governor would assist in potentially giving us an update, considering he is the one fully responsible under the Constitution in respect to this concern of a vote of no confidence by the staff, because I can't say what I've heard because it would be speculation, but some of the allegations are quite serious, and it'd be important to this Honourable House to know that the...
Honourable member, you have the question on the order paper. Are you seeking the Honourable Deputy Governor
Assistance, yes.
to assist by answering if he can? Honourable Deputy Governor.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Good morning. Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, I'm unable to discuss this matter. We're in the middle of an investigation, and it would be inappropriate for me to discuss this in this open forum.
I think that we would be well advised to not proceed with that question, Honourable Member from Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No more about the investigation other than to ask the Deputy Governor, could he give an idea of end of estimated time for this to be concluded? Because that was over 2 months ago since it started.
Honourable Deputy Governor.
Mr. Speaker, in the very short term.
Answer in due course. Can we move to the next item, please?
Personal explanations,
None.
obituary and other ceremonial speeches,
None.
raising of matters of privileges,
None.
government business, bills, second reading, the Defense Bill 2020, continuation of debate.
Continuation of debate on a bill for a law to provide for the establishment of a regiment for the islands and for incidental and connected purposes. The Honorable Member for Savannah caught my eye. The Honorable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, with the your leave and the agreement of the member, I just wanted to indicate to members that we have taken on board much that has been said in the debate. I am awaiting right now the final draft of the proposed committee stage amendments. As soon as I have it, I will circulate it to members so that it will help perhaps to allay some of their concerns and inform their debate.
Do you want to proceed? Do you want to proceed or you want to wait?
I have to leave again this evening.
The Honorable Member for Savannah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As most know, I've not been able to stay in the full sessions of the Legislative Assembly because of a medical procedure I had, and the reason I'm getting up now, I'll probably leave again after lunchtime. But I just wanted to make a brief contribution to this legislation. Mr. Speaker, it is my belief that this bill should have been titled the Governor's Defense Bill 2020. There are over 70 times governor or governor's order is mentioned throughout the legislation. Just alone in Section 10, and with your permission I will read briefly. That alone has 7 times. Governor may consult board. In the exercise of the powers and duties of the governor under this law, and any other enactment which relates to matters of defense, the governor may consult with or take the advice of the board as the governor thinks fit. But notwithstanding that the governor has consulted or taken the advice of the board on any matter, the governor may act in the governor's discretion on such matter in the exercise of the governor's delegated responsibility for regiment matters. Mr. Speaker, it is my belief that the original idea of the Cadet Corps was never intentioned to get to the level that it is now in this Legislative Assembly. Mr. Speaker, in light of how the civil partnership legislation was handled and managed by the governor, it terrifies me to give him more power. And I know, as the Premier said, which he's entitled to under the Constitution, to deal with our former Cadet Corps. It is my belief that no one expected this organization to explode to what is envisaged in this legislation. I saw it, Mr. Speaker, as bringing discipline to our young Caymanians, and in times of need, specifically, as the Honorable Premier talked about after Ivan, I'm sure no one has better experience in dealing with disaster since Hurricane Gilbert, Hurricane Ivan, Hurricane Paloma. And, Mr. Speaker, with limited external help, not to mention the 1932, which many of us have been told about. Mr. Speaker, 16 years ago, when we came down to this Legislative Assembly to discuss what was left of Cayman after Ivan, it is my understanding that the mother country sent us 25,000 cots or beds or whatever they wanted to call it. Nothing else that I know of. And as I said in this honorable House, if my mother treated me the way that the United Kingdom treated Cayman at that time, I would not be here today. Mr. Speaker, it is my belief that this power grabbing in these little islands is getting out of hand. If you go back and look, Mr. Speaker, and as you know, only you has been in here longer than I am, heading into my 29th year shortly. I've sat in cabinet 3 terms, and I've seen where all of the requirements made by external forces to amend our financial legislation, OECD, FATF, CFATF, and any other synonym that you can think of. And we jumped to amend our legislation. No matter what we do, Mr. Speaker, it is my belief that their intention is not to stop till they drive the Cayman Islands into the ground. And when that can possibly happen, when they open the registers in due course. Let us wake up and stop pussyfooting around with these people. Some of them don't mean us good. We have lived here in peace and good relationships with each other for over 500 years. And now in recent times, under the leadership of this administration, everything seems to be going haywire. Mr. Speaker, I am concerned we need to bring structure, but with the power and the plans and some of these, if the governor decides to go send them to foreign countries, he can do it. I'm sorry, I do not support it. I'm pleased to hear that the Premier is agreeing to some amendments. Mr. Speaker, I never thought I would see the day when, if we don't watch out, there'll be nothing left for us here in Cayman. Dog is going to eat our supper. And I never thought I would get to the stage when I would advocate that whoever takes over these islands in the next election seriously look at gradually getting away from this cumbersome noose that is tightening around our neck. And in other words, it's my little 4-year-old granddaughter talk about the bad word, independence. I pray for blessings on these islands as we go forward. We've come too far because I do believe that most of what we've accomplished and people look at us is through jealousy. Don't be afraid to cut the cord. May God bless us all.
Does any other member wish to speak? The Honourable Deputy Leader of the Opposition, the member for Newlands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the other day we were told that we were going to meet in camera to discuss some amendments to this bill. I then rose and suggested that since not all members had spoken, that it would be a good opportunity for us to meet in camera prior to anyone else spoke, because that could dramatically change the conversation on this bill. That didn't happen, but what did happen is that the Honorable Premier has now gotten up to advise us that we have some amendments coming that should address a lot of the concerns that have been presented. There's one problem with that, Mr. Speaker. I have not yet spoken. So unless someone over in the glass house can read my mind, nobody is aware of my concerns. I don't know if that signals to me that no one cares what I have to say. However, if I have not expressed any of my concerns yet, I don't see how we could be presented with amendments to this bill that would satisfy them. Mr. Speaker, I know they're working hard now, from now, to get rid of me. But I want to say one thing before I go into my debate on this bill. As long as I am the representative for Newlands, Grand Cayman, I am going to demand that the people in Newlands not be disrespected in that way. It is highly disrespectful to propose amendments that would satisfy my
Mr. Speaker.
concerns.
Mr. Speaker.
The Honorable Premier,
Mr. Speaker.
Honorable Member, can you give way?
Because I think the member has gotten it completely wrong, Mr. Speaker. No disrespect at all intended. I've said, as did the Deputy Governor more than once, that we are taking on board the representations from the other side, and we are working to address them. These changes have to be approved not just by me and my government, but by the Governor, and indeed in some cases by the FCO. So what I indicated to the member personally this morning, as well as other members, is that we had a draft which I hope would help to inform the debate of other members and might allay some of their concerns. I fully am aware that other members have not spoken, and if those representations are considered by us as worthy of inclusion in the amendments, they will get the same attention. The purpose of trying to let members have it is not to keep them from saying whatever they want to say or to disregard what they have to say, Mr. Speaker, but so that they don't necessarily go over ground again, which we have already conceded. That's what we're, no disrespect at all. In fact, the complete opposite. Mr. Speaker, I could have just kept them here until all the debate is finished, and then come and say, here we go. That I'm trying to do the opposite, Mr. Speaker. So no disrespect at all intended. I'm sorry that it's been seen that way or interpreted that way.
The Honorable Deputy Leader of the Opposition, continuing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I was saying, I took it as disrespect because I hadn't spoken yet. I haven't seen the amendments. However, if there's a commitment to take on board what I'm about to say, then I'll be a little more satisfied. Mr. Speaker, this is clearly a Section 55 bill. And why I say that is because clearly defense is listed under the governor's responsibilities in Section 55. But, Mr. Speaker, I am also disappointed in the way that this legislation has been created, this bill, and brought to this House, because, and I know other members touched on this, but I want to highlight just how concerning this is. We have recruited Caymanians into this regiment before the bill hit this House, before it was debated here. And while the Premier gave an explanation of how that was possible, from out of concern for those many Caymanians who have signed up, it means that they were not 100% clear on how this legislation would end up, because as we see, amendments are coming. And I was concerned because any controversies, as we have now, would catch them in the middle. And any objections from members of this Honorable House to the bill itself, not the regiment, but the bill, would be interpreted as a lack of support for these Caymanians who have bravely volunteered to serve this country. So I want to start off by saying, Mr. Speaker, I am overflowing with pride, especially when I could look up in the gallery and see many of them there listening to us, at those who have selflessly volunteered and stepped up to serve this country and to put themselves in harm's way if necessary. And this legislation and this debate is no reflection in any way on them, and I have said that to many of them personally. But, Mr. Speaker, I have to do my job. And my job, unfortunately, means I have to critique this bill, despite the fact that Caymanians have already been recruited into this regiment. And it's unfortunate that that happened. And Mr. Speaker, and my job includes critiquing. That is what the opposition, one of our responsibilities is. Mr. Speaker, I see a lot of similarities between this bill and the Bermuda Defense Act, 1965. 1965 was a long time ago, Mr. Speaker, just about 55 years. Those were colonial days. Now we have a bill presented to us that I've seen some very interesting similarities between that colonial language used in the Bermuda Act and this bill. Mr. Speaker, I have no issue with the idea of a regiment. Truth be told, Mr. Speaker, I recall when I was studying for my A-levels in sixth form, my first order of business when I was deciding what to do next in life was to enlist in the RAF, the Royal Air Force. I made inquiries and was told that I had to be living in England for several years before that would be allowed. And you can imagine my mother's pleasure and my disappointment in hearing that, because she really didn't want her son to become a soldier. But that was when, Mr. Speaker, I questioned this whole colonial arrangement that we had in place back then. And I instead shifted my attention to university, as my parents wanted me to do. And I'm glad to see now that there's been some change in the attitudes towards that arrangement of allowing British Overseas Territory citizens to serve in the armed forces. And while things are not ideal, they have been progressed. So, Mr. Speaker, my issue is not to focus on the creation of a regiment, which I think we all support. If I could turn back time, Mr. Speaker, I would be one of those young men who rushed to enlist. My own grandfather, Mr. Speaker, served in the Trinidad, I think what was called the Trinidad Home Guard. My grandfather, Mr. Ernest Pearson. But I'm glad, Mr. Speaker, that my desire to serve this country has now manifested itself in my role here as a legislator and representative. I recall actually having those conversations with myself, Mr. Speaker, when I came back here from Chicago, from university, after studying for my computer science degree. Because I was thinking, I remember distinctly the plane ride home and thinking, now that I've done this, accomplished this, how can I start to give back to this country? I was fortunate enough to go away on a private scholarship, but I still came back with that sense of giving back to the country. So, Mr. Speaker, staying in the United States and eventually serving in that country, a foreign state, wasn't appealing to me. And thankfully, politics has provided me with an avenue for doing that. And I'm forever grateful for that. So I have no regrets. Mr. Speaker, I think we all are familiar with the Calypso song by the Mighty Gabby, Government Boots. I'm not going to sing it today. I promise. But that song was banned in Barbados by the then Prime Minister Tom Adams for being too critical of his government. And there's some lyrics in there that sort of resonate with what I'm about to say here today. It says, can we afford to feed that army while so many children naked and hungry? Can we afford to remain so passive while that soldier army growing so massive? Mr. Speaker, I wish I could be more supportive of this legislation, but it is lacking. We are today creating a military force with legislation that I think, in my opinion, pays very little respect to our political development over the last 60 years. This legislation creates a military force that operates almost completely under His Excellency the Governor. One individual. And while the stated purpose of this regiment is to defend these islands, it was also put forward that there would be heavy involvement in disaster preparedness and recovery, especially when it came to hurricanes. But, Mr. Speaker, let's not fool ourselves. The legislation makes it quite clear what the focus is. This is going to create a regiment of soldiers. Soldiers who can be issued arms and ammunition. Soldiers who can kill or be killed. Soldiers who can be ordered away from the Cayman Islands, Mr. Speaker, either in defense of this country or in defense of some other country or to assist. But what concerns me is that those orders come squarely from the governor. Mr. Speaker, I would like to, in defense of the Cabinet and the Honorable Premier, make this point. If anybody is going to order any Caymanian to go in harm's way and risk their lives, I personally would be much more comfortable if there was some involvement from the Cabinet, and in particular, the Honorable Premier. Now, I know the bill was presented in a way that it said that that would be possible. It's not possible in all circumstances, but later on I'll explain something else that I would like clarified or perhaps changed, because I question whether the Honorable Premier could, by any means, intervene if he disagreed or any future Premier disagreed with those orders. Mr. Speaker, these are our people, Caymanians. I would be much more comfortable if the political direction of this country had a say. Mr. Speaker, this legislation, as it is now, prior to any amendments, is a throwback to our colonial days. In our modern day Cayman Islands, that has progressed and advanced to the point where we have just confirmed that we are getting more amendments to our Constitution to give us more autonomy, more internal control, and we get presented with this. This legislation, as it is written, has no place in a modern, developed Cayman Islands that has moved beyond colonial powers. Mr. Speaker, I cannot vote for this legislation as it is, and I'm looking forward to those amendments. But let me go into what concerns me, Mr. Speaker, and I hope that the powers that be are now listening, because this is where I will turn my attention to the clauses in the bill that I disagree with. Clause 3, Mr. Speaker. Any member of the regiment may be required to perform military services, including training and non-combatant services, both in and outside of the islands, at the direction of the governor. This is not quite, I noticed the member from Prospect touched on this and said that we were missing the fact that it said training and non-combatant services, but he glossed over the military services. We all know what military services are, Mr. Speaker. We can't say that there's going to be no possibility or little possibility that there could be some conflict. Clause 3 establishes the purpose of the regiment, including military service. Mr. Speaker, Clause 4. Subject to and in accordance with this law, there continues to be raised and maintained in the islands a reserve military force known as the Cayman Islands Regiment, consisting of a reserve force, and shall comprise such number of officers and persons as may from time to time be determined by the governor. What that means to me, Mr. Speaker, is that the governor determines or has the authority to determine the size of this regiment. That should raise some budgetary concerns, as I don't see anything in there saying that there has to be consultation with the cabinet with regard to that. And so it looks as if the governor would have the authority to create this regiment, as he does. But if you think about a situation where we may get a governor who is not that prudent or responsible, this regiment could grow in size to where it eats up, especially now that we're dealing with a global pandemic and finances are threatened. It eats up a lot of the budget that we can use for other things. Mr. Speaker, Clause 5, duties of the regiment. The regiment is responsible for A, the defense of the islands, providing humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. C, assisting the Royal Cayman Islands Police Service and the Coast Guard when called upon to do so, do so by the governor. And D, such other duties as the governor determines. Mr. Speaker, D is a huge concern. What other duties? Why would the governor, who is typically not a military person, determining what these other duties would be? As far as I'm concerned, Mr. Speaker, C as well, you would expect that the commanding officer would have some input on if the regiment was going to assist the Royal Cayman Islands Police Service, the Coast Guard, not just the governor. Clause 7, Mr. Speaker, in the exercise of the governor's powers and duties under this law, and any other enactment relating to matters of defense, including armed forces, the governor shall act in the governor's discretion. Again, the governor has ultimate authority, as this falls under Section 55, as I am well aware. But again, I want to raise the point, I would be much more comfortable to see some consultation with the Honorable Premier, whoever that may be. Clause 8, Mr. Speaker. The governor, acting in the governor's discretion, may A, delegate functions under this law to the deputy governor, B, delegate functions relating to the operations of the regiment to any minister after consultation with the premier, and C, by written notice to the deputy governor or to the minister at any time, revoke any functions so delegated. Speaker, the use of the word may concerns me in this clause. It means it is entirely up to the governor if any delegation is going to be done. And without knowing what is going to be delegated, in principle, it's hard to support this clause. We don't even know if it will be. It just says may. So, Speaker, Clause 9, the Defense Board. And I know that the member from Northside covered that in some detail, but I wanted to make these further points. If the appointments to the Defense Board are done solely by the governor, and the governor alone can revoke those appointments, if the governor can then walk into any meeting of the Defense Board and take the chairman's seat and direct the meeting, that is a very poor governance structure with very few checks and balances. It simply means that the board is under the complete control and discretion of the governor. I also raise the point, Mr. Speaker, that there is no input from the Honorable Premier, the Honorable Leader of the Opposition, as to the composition of this board, as is done with just about every other board there is. No elected member has any input. I would also like to see some tightening up of the language around the composition of the board. There should be certain, I know the Leader of Opposition will kill me for saying this, but classes of people, as you would understand from a legal point of view, who should make up this board. What I see here, this looks like a rubber stamping committee, and I'm not comfortable with it. Speaker, I see some amendments coming here now, but I won't have time to read them, so I will continue. Clause 10, Mr. Speaker. In the exercise of the powers of duties of the governor under this law and any other enactment which relates to matters of defense, the governor may consult with or take the advice of the board as the governor thinks fit. But notwithstanding that the governor has consulted or taken the advice of the board on any matter, the governor may act in the governor's discretion on such matter. This is one of those that the member from Savannah was talking about. He said, governor, I lost track how many times he said governor. But it means that the governor has total control and can ignore the board. What's the point of even having a board if that can happen? Mr. Speaker, Clause 11. The governor may appoint a defense medical officer whose duties include the examination of any person for the purposes of this law, and such other duties as may be conferred or imposed upon the defense medical officer by or under this or any other law. Again, Mr. Speaker, why not have the board make that appointment? Why does it all have to be the governor? That's why you have a board. There's a governance structure and checks and balances that should be utilized, working through a board. I wouldn't want to be on this board. I would have no responsibilities. Clause 12, Mr. Speaker. Command of the regiment. The governor shall appoint an officer known as the commanding officer who is a member of the regiment in whom the command of the regiment will be vested. And that officer is responsible for the control and administration of the regiment, subject to the governor's directions and to the provisions of this law. Subject to this law and the governor's orders, the commanding officer may make standing orders for the control, administration, and general government of the regiment, and B, issue a handbook, a code of practice, or such other guidelines as the commanding officer may see fit for the guidance, government, and regulation of members of the regiment. Mr. Speaker, again, complete control put in the hands of one individual. Clause 13, governor's orders. And 13.1 says, subject to this law, the governor may make general or special orders to be called governor's orders. Clause 2 says, without prejudice to the generality of the powers conferred upon the governor by subsection 1, provision may be made by governor's orders for the following. And it goes through A, the members of the regiment in whom command over any part of the regiment or members thereof is vested, and as to the circumstances in which such command is to be exercised. B, the formation of members of the regiment into subunits. C, for posting, attaching, or otherwise dealing with such members within the regiment. D, for attaching members of the regiment for service with the cadet corps established in the islands by or under any law. So now it's creeping over into non-55 matters and going into the cadet corps. E, for the constitution of a permanent staff, including officers, adjutants, warrant officers, and non-commissioned officers who may be members of the regiment or Her Majesty's Armed Forces. That raises an immigration concern I'm going to talk about later on, Mr. Speaker. F, for regulating the appointment and retirement of the commanding officer, other officers and members of the regiment and their numbers, ranks, and duties. That means for regulating the appointment and retirement of the commanding officer, other officers, and members of the regiment and their numbers, ranks, and duties. That's a very powerful clause, Mr. Speaker. That is, I can hire and fire. That's what that means. G, for the constitution and functions of a promotions board. I can also promote. Well, it would be delegated to a board, a promotions board. But then the bill doesn't go on to talk anymore about the composition of that board, who sits on it, who does what. 3, governor's orders may take the form of applying to the regiment with such modifications, exceptions, or variations as are specified in the governor's orders. The provisions of any order, regulation, or instruction made or issued in respect of Her Majesty's Armed Forces. So this means the governor can basically change the rules at will, Mr. Speaker. The governor's orders, again, give His Excellency total control and discretion in almost every area essential to the operation of this regiment, including wages and allowances. This gives him, and when I say him, could be him or her, whoever the governor may be. I'm not talking personally, but the position of governor. This gives much more budgetary oversight to the office of the governor. What if some of these governor's orders exceed what the Minister of Finance wants allocated for the regiment in going about his job in creating the government's budget? what will happen? Will it be that we have to come down here and appropriate more funds because the governor made a decision that he wanted more money? Why no input in this section, Mr. Speaker, from the Financial Secretary, Minister of Finance? Why no mention of the Public Management Finance Law? This gives the governor the ability, Mr. Speaker, to attach the regiment to a cadet corps without any input from the elected cabinet. The cadet corps is currently under the responsibilities of a minister, and now it has this extension reaching into it with no involvement from the executive, the cabinet. Clause 14, Mr. Speaker. 14.3. The governor, and this is in the section enlistment and period of service. The governor may consult the premier and may, in the governor's discretion, allow persons not meeting the requirements of subsection 1 to be enlisted into the regiment if the governor considers this to be in the best interest of the regiment. And subsection 1 talks about who can join the regiment. A Commonwealth or Irish citizen who is a permanent resident of the islands in accordance with the Immigration Transition Law. B, a British Overseas Territory citizen or a British citizen, and is either a Caymanian or a permanent resident within the meaning of the Immigration Transition Law 2018, may be enlisted into the regiment in such manner and subject to such conditions as are provided under this law and as prescribed. But then 3, the governor may decide to consult the premier, and he may, in his discretion, allow persons who don't fit with those requirements, not meeting the requirements of subsection 1, to be enlisted. This is bypassing the requirements in this bill, and it is also ensuring that that individual would not have to traverse through our immigration regime either. This is the governor saying, I decree this person can join the regiment, and that's the end of it. There's no check and balance there, Mr. Speaker. Suppose this individual needed to be vetted, and I heard suggestions, Mr. Speaker, that they should be vetted by the National Security Council. Suppose the governor made a mistake, and he's human, and decided that he was going to enlist someone in the regiment, and we find out that person came highly decorated, lots of experience, but may have been guilty of war crimes, crimes against humanity or something. One individual shouldn't be making that decision, Mr. Speaker. And I don't want this to come across as me condemning the governor, Mr. Speaker. I'm condemning the legislation. It shouldn't be written this way. Speaker, Clause 15. Only the governor can determine who is eligible and who has the authority, only the governor has the authority to allow someone to bypass the fitness and education requirements of the regiment. Clause 15, 5A. Clearly says the governor may make governor's orders. I think that's self-explanatory. But it means that with that ultimate authority, the governor can hire, fire, promote, transfer officers. This makes the governor more of a commander-in-chief with very little checks and balances built in. Clause 16.1, Mr. Speaker. An officer may, at any time, apply in the prescribed manner to the governor for permission to relinquish the officer's commission, and the governor, after considering the circumstances, may grant the application. Number 2, 16.2, subject to subsection 3. If the governor is satisfied that A, an officer is inefficient, and B, an officer has been guilty of neglect or duty neglect of duty or misconduct, or C, for any other cause, an officer should no longer be an officer, The governor may, by notice in writing under the governor's hand, require that officer to relinquish the officer's commission, or may, by the notice to the officer, dismiss that officer. I mean, that is the function of the commanding officer. Unless it's a commanding officer who's the subject of this action, which then the board should be dealing with that. I don't understand why all this has to be at such a high level. But look at 4, Mr. Speaker, 16.4. The relinquishment by an officer of the officer's commission or the dismissal of an officer shall not of itself operate so as to absolve the person who has been an officer from any liability under this law to be called up for military service, or so as to preclude the acceptance of the person's services as a volunteer. So how I interpret that, you can't quit. Even if you quit, you can still be called up. And this is supposed to be a voluntary institution. And I notice in 16.6, the reference to the Armed Forces Act, nothing in this section shall be construed so as to affect any liability to which an officer may be subject under the Armed Forces Act while the regiment or the subunit of the regiment in which he or she is an officer is embodied. Now, we had an explanation from a member on the other side that the Armed Forces Act protects, so to speak, this regiment. But if that's as far as that reference goes, then I'm okay with that. But if the Armed Forces Act is seeking to bring in any other responsibilities or duties, then I would be concerned. I haven't done the research to fully understand what the whole extent of this is, but I will take it on board that the points that were made. Mr. Speaker, Clause 18.1. Subject to subsection 3, where a member of the regiment is employed both by the regiment and by an exempted service, the member's employment obligations to the exempted service take priority over the member's employment obligations to the regiment. And for the purposes of subsection 1, exempted service means Her Majesty's Armed Forces, the Fire and Rescue Service, the Police, the Prison, Coast Guard, Officer of Hazard Management, Cayman Islands, service as an emergency medical technician or paramedic for a hospital, a person in holy orders or a minister in any religious denomination recognized by the governor as such for the purposes of this law. But look at 18.3, Mr. Speaker. Where necessary, in order to ensure the sufficient staffing of the regiment at any time, an exempted service specified in subsections 2, B through G, and the commanding officer shall consult with the governor and act in accordance with any direction given by the governor in respect of priority of employment of a member of the regiment. So what that tells me, the governor decides the priority of the members of the regiment. And the way I read that, if, for instance, there's a need for police officer who's a member of the regiment, an urgent need, and the governor decides, no, your responsibilities in this regiment are more important, the police will suffer. Take that, translate that to fire service, which falls under the responsibilities of a minister. How is it possible that you could have that sort of arrangement where resources could be taken from the fire and held in the regiment, and when you have a politician, an elected member who's responsible for that ministry that the fire falls under, and you have one individual just deciding, no, these resources are over here and they're staying. You can't have that. It is not practical, Mr. Speaker, for one individual to have all that authority. I would understand if there was some consultation with the cabinet, with the premier, before those decisions are made. But you can't just open the door and say, you have complete authority in doing that. Reality may be, Mr. Speaker, that a responsible individual in the post of governor would come and discuss it, but the law doesn't require it. And we don't know who we'll end up with in the future. Things may be good now, but they mightn't be good later on. Mr. Speaker, Clause 28.1. Again, under grounds for discharge. Embodiment of the regiment. 28.1. If the governor considers it necessary to do so, A, in the interest of public safety, B, for the defense of the islands, C, to assist with public safety in another British overseas territory or foreign state, or D, for any other reason as the governor sees fit, the governor may, by order published in the Gazette or otherwise made known to members of the regiment in such manner as may seem to the governor best suited to the circumstances, direct the regiment or any part of the regiment to be embodied. And 28.2, the governor shall consult the premier before making an order under subsection 1, unless the governor considers it impractical. So again, I know the member from Northside covered this. It says the governor shall, unless the governor feels it's impractical. I can't think of too many circumstances where it would be impractical. However, it is in there. 28.3, the governor shall seek the agreement of the premier before embodying the regiment for deployment to a foreign state, but agreement is not required for deployment within the islands or to another British overseas territory. I would prefer to see, instead of it saying the governor shall seek, which means he shall endeavor to get the agreement of the premier, it should say the governor shall obtain, or some other wording that carries more weight. Because I can easily come and ask for something, but that doesn't mean I'm going to get it. And the way I interpret this, Mr. Speaker, and this is going back to that point, the governor has the authority to embody this regiment, send it overseas, send it to a foreign state, put our Caymanians literally on the firing line if it's required, and not even the Honorable Premier, as the way I read this, has any input in that. That should not be, Mr. Speaker. Clause 31, Mr. Speaker. The period of embodiment of the regiment or part of the regiment shall be of such duration that the governor may determine and shall not terminate until the governor orders that the regiment or the part of the regiment shall cease to be embodied. Again, I just raise this concern. Yes, Section 55, the governor can do it. However, there are operational costs involved in doing that. If you have a protracted embodiment, it will bring with it financial concerns that I think the cabinet and the premier and definitely the Minister of Finance should be involved in. (43), Mr. Speaker. The governor, on receiving a recommendation from the commanding officer that a member of the regiment who is convicted by a summary court should be dishonorably discharged, may A, so discharge the member, or B, remit the case to the commanding officer, requiring the commanding officer to reconsider the commanding officer's recommendation. This, Mr. Speaker, seems to be a function that should be performed by the board. I think it is allowing the governor to interfere in the chain of command. This is a military institution. This is not just a business. The chain of command in military organizations is very important. I don't think that the governor should have that authority. At the very least, give it to the board. If the governor can refuse to discharge a soldier, Mr. Speaker, against the recommendation of the commanding officer, that creates a serious problem in the chain of command. It relegates the commanding officer to nobody. If a member of the regiment can just go and complain to the governor and say, well, this man wants to discharge me, can you stop him? It undermines the commanding officer, in my opinion. 42.3, Mr. Speaker. The governor, on receiving a recommendation from the commanding officer that a member should be dishonorably discharged, may so discharge the member, or B, remit the case to the commanding officer, requiring the commanding officer to reconsider the recommendation and any other punishment that the commanding officer has imposed, again, interfering in the chain of command. Military units have their own sort of tribunal system set up where grievances are heard, complaints, people can get a fair trial, but to have one individual say to a commanding officer, no, you're not doing that. It would be fine if the governor was part of the regiment, was a military person. But in this situation, I don't think that even the President of the United States can tell one of his generals what to do with his soldiers. The military unit deals with their own issues. The commander-in-chief. But that's a very high level. I don't think the president can go down and say, don't dishonorably discharge this man. I could be wrong. Clause 51, Mr. Speaker, and this is where it gets a little more interesting. The criminal, and this is when the governor can bring and conduct criminal proceedings. So 51.1, the criminal proceedings in respect of an offense against this law shall not, without the written consent of the Director of Public Prosecutions, be instituted by any person. It should stop there, but it goes on to say, other than the governor or by an officer or other person duly authorized by the governor in that behalf. So that means that without the approval of the DPP, the governor has the authority to order a criminal prosecution. That's the way I read it. I hope somebody tells me I read it wrong. But it says, the criminal proceedings in respect of an offense against this law shall not, without the written consent of the Director of Public Prosecutions, be instituted by any person. I think there should be a period there, but it goes on to say, other than the governor. That is allowing the governor to bypass the DPP, initiate criminal proceedings. That's serious. That is some serious power. I hope everybody's read this bill. 2, a prosecution for an offense against this law may be conducted before a court of summary jurisdiction by an officer duly authorized by the governor in that behalf. So the governor can not only order a prosecution, but he can say who will do the prosecuting. I leave that one with the Honorable Attorney General. He is way more experienced in this than I am, but I'm very concerned about that. So Speaker, Clause 63. And I go back to that one, Mr. Speaker, because that doesn't just apply to members of the regiment. That applies to anybody who breaks this law. So anybody. Anybody. Clause 63. The transitional provisions, Mr. Speaker. All other acts done or purported to be done by the governor and the regiment in furtherance of the establishment and operation of the regiment prior to the date of the commencement of this law shall be deemed on that date to have been lawfully done by the governor and the regiment. This is given blanket immunity from any wrongdoing. I'm not suggesting there has been any, but they want this legislature to give blanket immunity to anything done prior to the date this law was passed. I can't think of too many people that would do that for, Mr. Speaker. You have to be very near and dear to me for me to put my neck on the chopping block like that. So that needs to change. It needs to at least say, unless those actions would have been illegal under this law, at the very least, give me that. Because I am not putting my neck out that far for anybody. And Mr. Speaker, in making my point about this bill, clearly it's the defense bill. Defense is under Section 55, the governor's responsibilities, but there are lots of areas in here that stray outside the scope of Section 55, and I think that alone is justification for inserting, where I've suggested, and all the members have suggested, more involvement from the political directorate, from the Honorable Premier, the Honorable Cabinet. There's justification there because it's not entirely wrapped up in Section 55. There's concerns for budgeting that would definitely have to involve the Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, I want to read an article that I got off the BBC website.
Member, if this is a convenient time to break, we will suspend proceedings until 2 p.m. The Honorable Attorney General has asked us to meet with him in the committee room as soon as we break. So we will break at this time, suspend at this time until 2 p.m.